Welcome. Yeah. Go ahead.
Good evening, all dear students. And last time we had a muscle case, so we thought this time we will do a muscle quiz. You are all fresh with the muscle discussions. Now this quiz, I believe you have already downloaded the Slido app, and or if not, you can always type slido.com in your browser and enter this code G caps lock 316. Once you have entered that, it will take you to a page where right upper corner you have to enter your name and then join, and make sure that you go to the polls. There will be two options seen there: question and answer, and the polls. We'll be playing it on the polls, and then it will come automatically on your screens. So should we start, sir? Yeah.
Sure.
Devashish, I am actually audible, no?
Yeah.
Yes.
Definitely.
So should we start?
Sure.
Yes, Rakesh, you can start.
Fine. The code is G316, caps lock. Okay, so let's begin. So the first question, which is true? This is a very basic questions. Now you have to pick up the true statement. Thin filaments are myosin. Actin contains a head for binding myosin. Myosin is wound in two chains, and dystrophin binds actin to sarcolemma. So choose the correct answer. Now it will come. So join the quiz. And this is the question. You will get 30 seconds to answer. Okay, perfect. I think most of you have answered correctly. And this is the correct answer. So this is the very basic structure, dystrophin glycoprotein complex, and you should know everything about this complex. It looks very basic, but it's quite difficult. You have to really know about it. It's a dystrophin binds the actin with the sarcolemma. So this is the correct answer. Let's go ahead. Next question. So next question is, waddling gait is least likely in which of these conditions? Osteomalacic myopathy,
Yeah. Yes.
dystrophinopathy, limb girdle muscular dystrophies, or spinomuscular atrophy. Which of these is least likely to waddle? So get ready and vote. Okay, fine. I think I'll need to tell you the answer. So answer is limb girdle muscular dystrophy, and this we had discussed last time in the case also. See, waddling gait basically means weakness of hip abductors, and it is actually Trendelenburg sign. Trendelenburg sign means the pelvic drop during the swinging phase of the limb, and this happens because of the weakness of the abductor muscles, gluteus medius and gluteus minimus. Now, waddling gait, normally we associate with all the myopathies, and you can see all the list, practically all myopathies will actually waddle because of the weakness. It's only the limb girdle muscular dystrophies, which we know in our country, they have intact hip abductors, and they have weak hip adductors. So limb girdle muscular dystrophies do not waddle. and other myopathies clearly what? So answer is limb girdle muscular dystrophy. So remember, it's because of hip abductor weakness, which is paired in patients of limb girdle muscular dystrophy. Okay, next question. So very important, contractures, we know it's quite common, and contractures can really pinpoint to a typical myopathy. It's such a penny dropping sign, So the question is, contractures are noted in all except dysferlinopathies, Bethlehem myopathy, calpainopathy, and Emery-Dreifuss myopathy. So get ready and vote, please. Okay, perfect. I think half of you have done very nicely. The answer is except in dysferlinopathy, all three will have classical contractures, and I'll give you a short answer to that. See, if you see the contractures, the prototype is Emery-Dreifuss. These are the patients who have classical posterior cervical contractures, proximal contractures, spinal contractures, typical rigid spine, and these patients are moving around with a lot of contractures, less amount of muscle weakness, and they have cardiac problems. So this is a typical prototype. Calpains can have very early on elbow contractures, and because they're toe walking, they normally toe walk, and they have typical ankle contractures. Same with Duchenne muscular dystrophies, which they start walking on toes very, very early on. They have typical ankle contractures. Bethlehem has very classical finger contractures. They have proximal contractures and the finger contractures. And I have shown you this Bethlehem hand, it is called, It's a very typical feature of Bethlehem. But one of the most typical is actually Urolich. They have proximal contractures and there's a distal laxity. If you see somebody with a proximal contracture and distal laxity, or maybe the long flexor contractures, it clearly means you're dealing with a collagen 6 myopathy. So they are very, very typical points. Contracture must always be sought for in all patients of myopathies, irrespective of their phenotype. And it's a penny dropping, it's a pathognomonic sign. Fine. So let's go ahead. It's all okay, sir? It's going smoothly?
Perfect.
Fine.
I think it's perfect.
Okay. Now, again, a question on clinical phenotype. True muscle hypertrophy is seen in all except, I'm talking of true muscle hypertrophy, spinomuscular atrophy, S1 radiculopathies, Duchenne, and myotonia congenita. So true muscle hypertrophy is seen in all except, get ready and vote. So which has pseudo muscle hypertrophy among all these four? Perfect. Absolutely correct. Most of you have answered very nicely. Absolutely correct.
I think
So when we talk of muscle
Rakesh,
hypertrophy, yes,
hello,
yes.
Rakesh. One person, just a comment. One person is answering on the live thing. He has to answer on the Slido.
Okay.
He's not answering on the Slido. He's answering on the
Q&A section of Zoom.
When you have to go to the polls.
I'll reply to him. Devashishar, I will reply to him.
Yes. Okay.
Immediately.
Yeah.
So when we talk of muscle hypertrophy, it is important to know there are true muscle hypertrophies and pseudo muscle hypertrophies. True muscle hypertrophy means there is a real enlargement of the muscle fibers. Now that you see in, surprisingly in many neurogenic conditions, and SMA type 3 is of course quite common. you can get it in L5S1 radiculopathy, and it is said that it happens because of the complex repetitive discharges which these patients of radiculopathy has, and there is a internal physiotherapy of the muscle, and that is how the muscle actually becomes bulkier. Of course, the true myogenic is myotonia congenita. These patients have true muscle hypertrophy. They are quite Herculean, they are well built, and it seems that they are doing some gymming, but it's an internal gymming of the muscle. Pseudo hypertrophy occurs because of some infiltration inside the muscle, and all muscular dystrophies will have the pseudo muscle hypertrophy. Hypothyroid myopathy is also a kind of pseudo muscle hypertrophy because of the infiltration of inflammatory cells inside the muscles. And if you see the SMA type 3 and Duchenne, they will look exactly similar, you know, similar ages, similar calf hypertrophy, similar level of CK elevations, and you have to rely on your clinical, you know, kind of phenotype to know which way things are, you know. So, I mean, muscle hypertrophy, you can easily see in neurogenic conditions, but they are true muscle hypertrophies. Okay, so we go to next question now. So again, a question on phenotype. This is a very typical phenotype, you know, scapuloperoneal. Patient has got scapular winging and has got tibialis anterior weakness, foot drop of a varying degree. And it is a feature of all except, so which of these does not have a scapuloperoneal phenotype? So get ready and vote. Please think and answer. You know, it's a little bit tricky. Okay, it's a divided house. So, okay, so we'll discuss, I think, yeah. I told you it's little bit moderately tough question. Okay, so I mean these phenotypes one must know. No, they are all clinchers. You know, if you mug them, you know, they are clinchers. If you get isolated tibialis anterior weakness, you have to think about distal myopathies. And GNE myopathy is of course very common in India, and we have heard last time in our case presentation. And there are other ones like Woods and Lang's myopathy, which can affect the tibialis anterior. Willander affects the upper limb. So they are all distal, classical distal myopathies. Dysphallopathy, of course, is quite typical to have a TA weakness. Myotonic dystrophy, they can easily present with a TA weakness, isolated TA weakness before you see the other clinical signs. Sporadic inclusion body mass, that is again a very typical. He's an old man. These patients are a little older, and they can begin with TA weakness, quadriceps weakness, little bit asymmetrical. And this question mark I have put to tell you in next slide, one more very typical cause of TA weakness. If you get TA weakness plus winging, scapuloperoneal pattern, you have facioscapulohumeral muscular dystrophy, which has typical facial weakness added to it. Emery-Dreifuss, remember patients of Emery-Dreifuss, lot of contractures, they easily can have a winging and a TA scapuloperoneal pattern. Remember Pompe's is a treatable disease. We know that patient come with typical breathlessness, but they can easily come with a scapuloperoneal pattern. You must know that Pompe can also come like that, and a centronuclear. One of the very typical point, inability to stand on the toes, will be a clincher. It indicates dysphallopathy or anoctaminopathy. Scalpine does not have TA weakness. You know, they may look like having, but because of the ankle contractures, they walk on the toes. So answer is scalpine, which does not have a TA weakness or a scapuloperoneal pattern. So remember this, these are very typical points of the phenotypes. Okay, so one clinical question to you all. You know, this is a little bit elderly patient who has a very sad story. You know, 2 years he developed initially bilateral foot drop, and he was being investigated what is the cause of foot drop, and this was followed by hip girdle weakness, some sort of inflammatory myopathy. There are many thoughts going on that why this patient has a rapidly progressive weakness, and ultimately he dies of a cardiorespiratory failure. He had a myopathic ailment. So which of the myopathy can cause this typical pattern in a little bit elderly gentleman? Amyloid myopathy, inclusion body you think of, you are thinking of myofascial febrile myopathies or myotonic dystrophy. He had a myopathic ailment and he died of that. Please get ready and answer. Okay, fine. So divided house. Yeah, some people have answered correctly. So answer is myofibrillar myopathy. It's an under-recognized myopathy, and we must know about it. Why? Because these are the group of myopathies, myofibrillar myopathies, which has a common histological features, and they have degeneration of myofibrils around the Z disc. Actually, basically because of the lack of the Z disc proteins, and commonly we know they are desminopathies, myotoniopathies, but desminopathies are the most common which we see. Age of onset is little bit elderly. Remember, they can come with lot of phenotypes, practically all kind of phenotypes, but the distal phenotype, tibialis anterior weakness, sometimes it can be both TA and calf weakness, distal weakness, foot drop, calf weakness, and they rapidly progress to a limb girdle pattern. And one of the most killing point in these patients, they have very prominent cardiac conduction defects and a failure, and they often succumb to that. And to confuse you all, they can also have associated neuropathies. So this is a very typical myopathy. So if you see somebody, elderly patient with a distal weakness and rapidly progressing, some cardiac problem coming up, it can very well be a myofibrillar. So keep in mind this distal, which is the most commonest pattern, and with a very prominent cardiac conduction problems. Okay, so inflammatory myopathy. All are true about sporadic inclusion body myositis, except, I have given the answer also, onset less than 40 years, they have early quadriceps weakness. Autoantibody tests, which has come up now, is quite useful, and EMG is often neurogenic. So all are true, except pick up the false statement here. Get ready and vote. Okay. So, yeah, so practically all of you have answered correctly. And inclusion body myositis, we all know it's a different kind of inflammatory myopathy. It doesn't fit into the other categories of inflammatory myopathy. It's a little different. It is found in older age group, has asymmetrical pattern, and typical weakness. We know that they develop a distal weakness and a quadriceps weakness. This is just to show you the hand weakness. The hand weakness is typically in the flexor digitorum profundus, and that too in not all the fingers to begin with. So if you ask the patient to make a fist, you will see that some of the FDPs are not contracting. They have intact flexion at the metacarpophalangeal joint, saying that their FDS is reasonably intact compared to FDPs. And that is why they can flex at the MP joint, but they have FDP weakness. And one of the very typical thing which has come up nowadays is a serum biomarker, which is a antibody against the cytosolic nucleotidase, which is quite useful. It has been found that in a given clinical pattern, if these antibodies are positive, it really clinches the diagnosis, because even if you suspect this myositis, that inclusion body myositis, it is quite difficult to prove because of the biopsy difficulties. So this antibody is quite useful. EMG, as I told you, can often be neurogenic, and confusing with actually motor neuron disease, anterior horn cell disease. So remember, they can be neurogenic patterns rather than myopathic patterns. So that's IBM for you. Okay, fine. So typical again phenotype is a young girl with 2-year history of bilateral foot drop and she was progressing like that. On examination, she has normal quadriceps. CPK is not very high, 500, and she underwent a biopsy which shows this pattern. So what is your answer? Get ready and vote. This should be simple. Perfect. So yes, so most of you have answered correctly. This was quite simple, and we have discussed this case in the muscle discussion last week. This typical GNE gene myopathy, which with the intact quadriceps, tibialis anterior weakness. Remember, they can develop, as sir has told you last time, they can develop a proximal hip girdle weakness also, but quadriceps are often spared. Quadriceps can sometimes be weak in this patient. It has been described in around less than 5% of patients. They can also have weakness of the intra-CI muscles, and treatment is basically salicylic acid, and people are trying to prove that salicylic acid works here, but still there is no definite answer. But it's a very typical myopathy which we see in our country, GNE gene myopathy. Okay, so let's go ahead now. Okay, so inflammatory myopathy. Which of these antibodies in dermatomyositis is associated with best chance of steroid responsiveness? You have NXP2, TIF1, MI2, MDA5. These are all myositis specific antibodies. So please vote. Which has the best outcome, best chance of steroid responsiveness? Please answer. Perfect. Absolutely correct. Most of you got it correct. So if you see the myositis specific antibodies in dermatomyositis, I mean, you have these antibodies only in DM. You don't have much of these antibodies in, except for, as I told you, in patients of inclusion body myositis, only one antibody, but these are typical in DM. You have 4 or 5, but these are very typical. So the MI2 is associated with what we know as DM. They have very classical rashes. They respond well to the treatment, and they have low risk of malignancies. That is a typical MI2 which we see. TIF1 has got very high cancer risk. MDA5 you must know, because this is characterized by what is called as inverse Gottron. Inverse Gottron means you have rashes on the palmar side, the interphalangeal joint creases, this finger creases, but on the palmar side, on the dorsal side. So it's a very typical point of MDA5. Remember, these MDA5 are least myopathic. They can have muscle weakness, but they are least myopathic, but they have a very poor outcome because they have very high malignancy risk. They also have got chest problems. So this MDA5 carries a very bad prognosis. NXP2 is very typical for subcutaneous calcification, especially in juvenile dermatomyositis. So all these antibodies do give you some prognostic information. MI2 being the best one out of them. Okay. So one, endocrine myopathy. So all are true about thyrotoxic myopathy, except they have rapid weakness, they can have high CAs, they are associated with periodic paralysis, and of course they have anxiety and tremors. So all are true about thyrotoxic myopathy except one. So pick up the wrong answer here about thyrotoxic myopathy. Perfect. Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. So thyrotoxic myopathy is one of the myopathies. See, remember the CKs, I mean, somehow they don't correlate with the muscle weakness for some reason. CK, of course, indicates myofiber damage, but somehow they don't. I mean, these are the classical conditions where despite having significant weakness, it can confuse you that the CKs remain normal. One of them is thyrotoxic myopathy. Despite having severe, the CKs will not rise. This is a very rare kind of myositis, which I pulled out, it is seen in basically patients who are immunodeficient parvovirus B19 myositis, where despite weakness, the CKs will remain normal. Dermatomyositis, you must remember, and this is because in DM, often the damage is more in the subcutaneous tissue and the fascias rather than the muscle. So DM, despite having significant weakness, the CKs may not rise. And in fact, it was thought in some time back that if DM has normal CK, it indicates a poor prognostic outcome, which probably is actually controversial, but it was thought that it indicates a poor outcome. And of course, critical illness myopathies, which we see in our patients, can have significant weakness with a normal CK. So remember these conditions with a normal CK and quite significant myopathic weaknesses. Okay. Fine. So again, one patient, elderly patient, 50s, 2-year history of mild hip flexor weakness, and he is walking with a lordotic gait. Lordotic gait will indicate a gluteus maximus weakness, hip extensor weakness. He is waddling also. He has mild scapular winging. He has large calves, but CKs were not very high, and so, I mean, if this patient comes to a clinic, you will have all kind of differential diagnosis. Maybe it's a Becker, or there's so many differentials you will think of, with large calves, CKs not very high, so Becker probably unlikely. And he also adds that he's feeling breathless, which somehow sounded not very specific complaint, but yes, when you ask the patient, he did complain of breathlessness. So which is the best test to diagnose this patient? You will look for muscle biopsy. You will do a gene panel directly without thinking, without thinking of the disease. You will do muscle MRI, or you will do this dried blood spot enzyme assay for GAA. So get ready and vote. Perfect. Almost half of you have answered correctly. And this is typical Pompe. See, breathing difficulty, early respiratory failure. I think nowadays Pompe disease one should not miss, and Pompe disease is not very easy sometimes to diagnose because of wide variety of phenotypic patterns which this disease can come up, limb girdle, scapuloperoneal. You can have large calves, you can have winging, and of course one of the clincher is an early respiratory failure. And this is just a biopsy to show you this glycogen-related muscle biopsy. Remember, Sanofi gives free of cost, which I think is still free, Lumizyme enzyme, and this after giving this enzyme replacement, glucosidase, which you check by this blood spot level. It's just a very simple test. Just take a drop of blood and put it in that blood spot, which gives, I think the company only gives you, and you can easily confirm in your clinic that patient has got GAA or acid maltase deficiency. So this is Pompe's disease, classical. Remember, know everything about Pompe's disease. It can be treated and stabilized. Fine. So another patient. This is the patient who was being treated for polymyositis, for 3 years. So quite some time has gone in this patient, and patient has never responded to treatment. And you keep on wondering what it is and what is the next option in this patient. You will do a repeat muscle biopsy. You will send for dystrophic panel, the gene panel. You will escalate immunotherapy. I will just label as a non-responder in polymyositis. These are all florid inflammatory cells in these patients. Get ready and answer. Perfect, absolutely. It's good to see that at least I think there are a lot of third year residents exam going who are taking the quiz, and I can make out from the answers. Absolutely perfect. Fine. See, it's not always easy. Remember, it's not always easy to I have given 3 year story. It can be 1 year, 2 year, little shorter story, and you'll always be. I'm dealing with a muscular dystrophy, or it's a polymyositis, inflammatory myopathy. Now if you read this search paper which has come in Neurology India, 2008, there is a scoring system which you can take all these points, and if you are confused, you can score the patient. If the score is less than 8, it will favor a dystrophy. Probably you're dealing with a muscular dystrophy. And if it more than 13, 8 to 13 are a little gray zone, but more than 13 clearly favor that you're dealing still with a inflammatory myositis. And so the score is quite useful. And this happens because many of the muscular dystrophies, large amount of inflammatory cells in them, and that it will always confuse you. And the classical example is dysferlinopathies, which can easily masquerade as a inflammatory myopathy. Facioscapular humor, even Becker can have lot of inflammatory cells in their muscle biopsies, and if the histories are short, it is always little confusing which way things are. And the treatment of inflammatory myopathies can be toxic. So use this scoring system, it's quite useful. Fine. So electrical myotonia without clinical myotonia is seen in all except osteomalacic myopathies, Pompe's disease, statin myopathy, centronuclear myopathy. You have put the needle, you have found myotonia, get ready, answer. But there is no clinical myotonia in these patients. I think 15 seconds should have sufficed. Actually.
Yeah, they're all very bright guys.
Yeah, they're answering. I thought I have put some tough questions. They're all answering. Oh, so okay. Fine. So I think this is tough for everybody. Answer is osteomalacic myopathy. You do not see any electrical myotonia. Forget about clinical myotonia in them. Fine. So you see, Pompe's disease is one of the very typical example of having electrical myotonia without clinical, and you classically see in paraspinal muscles. So if you suspect Pompe's, needle paraspinal muscles, myotonias, if it is there, it clearly clinches. Myotubular myopathy or a centronuclear myopathy is a kind of congenital myopathy, and it classically can have myotonic discharges in their EMGs. Myofibrillar myopathy, which we just had a case, can again have very clear-cut electrical myotonia without any clinical myotonia. Drug-induced myopathy, statins can have florid myotonic discharges. It can easily confuse you if you do not take a history of statin, and they can have very florid myotonia without clinical myotonia. And of course, hypothyroid patients, Hoffman syndrome, can have electrical myotonia. They can sometimes have plus minus clinical myotonia also. But remember, they can easily have very florid electrical. So remember these conditions. When you put needle, it can confuse you. Okay, this is the spotter of muscle MRI. What do you say? I have put a needle here. The pointer, it points to the subcutaneous tissue. Look at the muscle. These are actually stir sequences. Muscle is also bright, and the subcutaneous tissues also seems to be involved. So which is this myopathy? Get ready and answer. Absolutely perfect. It is dermatomyositis. And when you see this is a very typical pattern of DM. Muscle, in the stir sequence, you will see the combination of muscle, but always look at the subcutaneous tissue. If it is involved, it is actually dermatomyositis. You will not see this pattern in any other inflammatory myopathies. So remember this pattern. Of course, DM will have other things to diagnose. Okay, this is given to me by my colleague, Dr. Rajesh Beni. It is his case, and he was kind enough to give me. 50-year-old man who had muscle pain, muscle weakness. This patient had cardiomyopathy. But one of the typical point was that on tapping the thigh, you could feel that it's woody hard. You can easily knock the thigh. And this is the muscle scan which he has given me. And you can, the muscle looks okay in the stir sequences, but you can see the subcutaneous tissue again, and it's a very typical pattern. So what is your answer? What kind of myopathy this patient has? Please vote. The subcutaneous tissue was showing some changes. I didn't show you for a long time, but let's vote. Absolutely correct. Excellent. Very typical. This patient actually was a case of systemic amyloidosis. And I wanted to show you the MRI, which is a very classical marked reticulation of the subcutaneous tissue with very less amount of muscle affection. This is a very typical reticulated pattern, sieve, like a sieve, and it will make you feel the skin is body hard. It's a amyloidosis, amyloid myopathy. Very rare, but quite typical. Okay, fine. So just answer this. Think about this and then answer. Symptomatic heart failure is a feature of all except Becker muscular dystrophy, myofibrillar myopathies, myotonic dystrophy, and acid maltase deficiency. All will have a congestive heart failure except. Please vote. Okay, fine. So we'll discuss. 30% of you got it correctly. Okay, answer is myotonic dystrophy. See, remember, heart involvement, of course, you all know it can be either a cardiac arrhythmias or congestive heart failure. Most of the conditions will cause both the things, but some of them are quite typical. You have for cardiac arrhythmias, you have got Anderson-Tawil syndrome, which causes hypokalemic periodic paralysis with facial dysmorphism. It's a very, very classical syndrome. Remember, myotonic dystrophy causes a lot of AV conduction block, cardiac arrhythmias, but cardiac failures are literally unknown. They do not cause any congestive heart failures. Amyloidosis causes both. Kearns-Sayre causes classical arrhythmias. Congestive heart failure, we discussed Pompe's, very typical carnitine deficiency, rare kind of myopathy, amyloidosis, and Becker. So remember, these two are different. Myotonic dystrophy causes cardiac conduction problems and not the congestive heart failure. So de novo respiratory failure means presenting with respiratory failure. Early, very, very early respiratory failure occurs in all except can present with respiratory failure except myotonic dystrophy type 1, acid maltase deficiency, Nemaline myopathy, and mitochondrial myopathy. So what is your answer? Please vote. Presentation with respiratory failure. Okay. Okay, fine. Answer is mitochondrial myopathy. As we all know, Nimmalin myopathy is a very has a lot of phenotypes and lot of phenotypic wide spectrum. But one of the common thing is that they have axial muscle weakness, they have facial muscle weakness, bulbar muscle weakness, respiratory muscle weakness, tubercular weakness, and they can easily present with a de novo ventilatory failure. Remember, myotonic dystrophy can easily can actually present with, I'm not talking of as a part of the syndrome, they can easily present with central sleep apneas. And that is why fatigue is a very prominent symptom in patients of myotonic dystrophy. They can present with that. FKRP can present with de novo respiratory failure. Mitochondrial often they will not present with a de novo ventilatory failure. So remember, these are, ventilation, cardiac, they're all clinchers in that wide myopathic spectrum. Simple question, critical illness myopathy is due to, you have to choose one answer. Length of ICS stay on ventilators, limb restraints, systemic inflammatory response syndrome, sepsis lasting for more than 48 hours, or exposure to steroids and NM blockers. So please vote an answer. Should not, it's a very easy question. Last 4 questions, I think. Then we'll be through.
That's perfect. Yeah.
Perfect, absolutely correct. So it's exposure to steroids and neuromuscular blockers, which is most likely the cause of what is called as myosin losing myopathy. If you biopsy them, you will see myosin loss, type 2 fiber loss, and critical illness. Remember, critical illness myopathies are little different than critical illness neuropathy. So you should know the clinical pattern of these presentations. But yes, exposure to steroids. Okay, so tell me this, very high CPK means around 50 to 100 times the upper range of normal, which is around 200, is seen in all except caveolinopathies, Duchenne muscular dystrophies, calpainopathies, and facioscapulohumeral dystrophy. So very high CKs are seen in all except. Please answer. Absolutely correct. Absolutely. Answer is FSHD. You don't see very high CKs. And other conditions, of course, we all know CKs can go. CPK elevation depends on the sex and race. You have Black Americans, where the normal CK is 1,200 upper range, like compared to us, where it is only 200. It, of course, indicates a degree of myofiber damage, but somehow CPK, as we discussed, they do not correlate with the muscle weakness, actual muscle weakness patterns. But yes, very high CKs will lead you to some kind of conclusions. Okay. All are true about calpainopathy except prominent calves, winging of scapula, early contractures, abdominal hernia. So, which is the wrong statement here? Perfect. So you don't get large calves in calpainopathies. And calpainopathy patients are basically wasted habitus, thin, lean patient walking on the toes. They have very prolonged courses, winging of scapula, hip adductor weakness, and of course there is a founder mutation. If you see a patient from this from this community, you can easily ask for only one gene and it will be calpain. It's that kind of, you know, important feature. Okay, so calpainopathy is here for you. Okay. Okay, now tell me this. You know, this is around 40-year-old man who used to be a cricket state level player. You know, he used to play cricket at a state level, fairly good. You know, now he comes with 10 years. Last 10 years, he has become weaker in the legs. Quadriceps are 4. TAs are mildly weak. Hip flexors are 3+. There is no winging. Upper limbs are absolutely normal despite 10-year story. Reflexes are absent. Sensory normal. CPKs are 5,000. So clearly a myopathic ailment. What is your answer? So please vote. Absolutely perfect. Fine. So the idea of showing you that there is some link to teenage exercises. If somebody is an athlete in his teenage years, there is some predisposition to dysferlinopathies. They have other typical points of calf pains, you know, which can be quite prominent, very odd to, you know, explain. They are, as we discussed, they can easily mimic polymyositis. And of course, they are very typical feature of inability to stand on the toes, but they can also have a anterior tibial variant. So dysferlinopathies, the idea to show was this teenage exercises and this calf pains. So dysferlinopathy. Okay, so tell me, this adult onset myotonic dystrophy type 1 is acquired from whom? Mother, father, either sporadic? Please vote. So it's an adult onset. I mean, beyond 18 years or 20 years of age. He has acquired from whom? Okay, fine. We'll discuss this. And fine. Remember, we know that it's a CTG repeat disorder. There is a phenomena of anticipation, and somehow when you have a congenital onset, meaning more than 1,000 repeats, it comes from the mother. So you have a baby with a congenital myotonic dystrophy with a fish mouth appearance, and you will always check the mother first. You know, mother may have very mildly affected mother. She will come to know at that time only that, okay, I am also suffering from a very mild myotonic dystrophy. So mother somehow, because of anticipation, gives rise to large number of repeats, causing either a congenital onset or a childhood onset. The adult ones, which has less number of repeats, they are acquired. You have to check the father. They have acquired the disease from the father and not from the mother. You know? So this is a little bit peculiarity of anticipation in myotonic dystrophy type 1. Following are true about dystrophinopathy, except pick up the wrong answer. This is about Duchenne and Becker's. Reading frame decides the phenotype. Motor milestones are normal in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Cardiac is more involved in Becker compared to Duchenne. Steroids alter the natural course of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So get ready and please answer. All are true except one. I think last 2 questions, sir.
Yeah.
I should have kept 15 seconds. You know. Next time we'll do this.
Next time.
Yeah. I'll go quickly. Yes, correct. Most of you have answered correctly, but it's a divided house. Answer is motor milestones. Motor milestones are grossly delayed, you know. So what matters in Duchenne phenotype is a reading frame. It doesn't matter the size of deletion. You can have a small nonsense codon which will disrupt the whole frame, and you will have absolute lack of functional dystrophin causing Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So size of deletion does not matter. What matters is the reading frame. Remember, cardiac involvement in Becker is far more than Duchenne. I mean, if you see a small boy with a prominent cardiac involvement, probably you're dealing with this boy. Of course, you must have done the genetic mutation, but genetic mutations can sometimes give you a wrong impression. But cardiac involvement, if it is there, you know that this patient probably will turn out to be a Becker rather than a Duchenne. Language and motor milestones are grossly delayed in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Steroids, we all know, helps to a great extent in patients of dystrophinopathies. All are true about paradoxical myotonia, except quicker. I think you can answer directly. Pick up the false statement about paradoxical myotonia. Absolutely correct. So it's a paradoxical myotonia, which will in fact worsen with exercise. There is no warm phenomena. I will just tell you one point, if you see a eyelid closure myotonia, which we normally see, close the eye and open the eyes, if it is there, probably you are dealing with a non-dystrophic myotonia, channelopathy. Because in myotonia, in myotonic dystrophic, you often do not get an eyelid closure myotonia, you get grip and tongue myotonia. So this is just a short point, eyelid closure myotonia is, and then of course this was a classical case of sodium channel myotonia, paradoxical myotonia, and we all know cold induced facial and bulbar weaknesses, and of course they get hyperkalemic periodic paralysis. So remember about this eyelid closure myotonia. Safest statin, please answer. Which is the safest statin? Okay, divided house. Okay. Answer is rosuvastatin. You can see this graph, the chances of rhabdomyolysis is least with rosuvastatin. Cerevastatin, in fact, was withdrawn because it caused a lot of rhabdomyolysis. So rosuvastatin is the safest statin. Simvastatin is not very safe. Last, I think, 2 questions. These are 4 patients of necrotizing autoimmune myositis who are positive for HMG antibodies. Pick up the patient which has the worst outcome. They're all NAM patients, inflammatory myopathy who are antibody positive. Pick up the patient who has the worst outcome. Somebody who is statin exposed and there is a patient who is not exposed to statin. So sorry. Okay, fine. This probably a little tougher, Remember, somebody who is not statin exposure it's somewhat blessing in disguise. It improves the outcome. So if you have NAM plus statin and little bit older patients, they will improve much better than somebody who is not exposed to statin, has a NAM, but actually is positive for antibodies. So and those are young patients, they will not respond. Okay, last 2 questions, I think. So this was Spinraza, which was approved for SMN, and I want you to guess the cost of it, which is, of course, it's a game changer drug, but probably out of reach. Can you guess the annual cost of this injection? This was approved for spinal muscular atrophy, and because it adds SMN2, it will add exon 7 to SMN2. You know that SMN2 basically decides the phenotype. SMN1 is already gone, but the injection the cost is prohibitory. Okay, it's 5 crores annual. I don't know who will afford this. Okay, last question to you. Second wind phenomena is a feature of all. I'm sorry, it's a feature of which disease? Very easy question, not so difficult. Pick up one answer. Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. So remember, second wind phenomena. Oh, fantastic. So Prachi is the winner. Second wind phenomena is pathognomonic for McArdle's. It just tells you that you still have a second wind. If you continue to put efforts, there is always a second wind to help you on. So, I mean, it gives you a kind of message also, this McArdle's disease. Anyway, I'm through with the quiz. The winner, should I announce?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Prachi is the winner. Congratulations, Prachi. 22 out of 28. Then Alex Baby, 20 out of 28. Neha, 19 out of 28. SNA, 18. Manoj, 18. I'm sorry for little extension,
No, I think it was brilliant.
Yeah.
It was brilliant, Rakesh. Very well done.
Thank you.
Now, I think
I'll stop sharing.
In the people who are logged in, there are some senior people I see. There's Dr. Rajesh Verma, who's professor of neurology at the King George University. There's Megha Damane, there's Ashok Shirsar. So if any one of you senior people who have taken their time out to log in, if they have any suggestions, questions, comments, please do go ahead. You can raise them on the chat or wherever you want. And I think Rakesh did a brilliant job, as you saw. He told you about so many different phenotypes, so many markers in the electrophysiology, so many markers in the radiology. I just want to make one perspective comment that when you're looking at a patient, please look at everything. When you're looking at not a myopathy patient, any patient, look at everything. When did the disease start? Where did it start? What is it taking in? How slowly is it progressing? What all is it affecting? And what's the phenotype? So don't go by one marker. If you go by one marker, you're less likely to be accurate. Put everything together and you're more likely to be accurate. So these are all very important facts, but in isolation, their meaning is less. Right. So with that, we go to the second part of the today's evening. We've got Dr. Akash Chadha, who is a clinical neurologist. He's a lecturer in neurology at the prestigious King Edward Medical College Department of Neurology. And he's worked on the Babinski sign. So he's going to discuss one clinical sign, the Babinski sign. I think clinical signs for the DM neurology training are very important. And you got to master the clinical signs so that you are yourself confident as to what they mean. And Babinski is the most important probably in the neurological examination. So Akash will tell you various parts of the Babinski. If you got your questions, do put them in. So Akash, welcome. And do go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Sir, is the screen visible?
Yes, very much so.
Yes,
Yes, very much, Akash. Please go ahead.
Akash, sorry to interrupt. Did you check that optimized screen sharing if you have videos?
I'll be showing it in the next PowerPoint. This is a different one. So.
Okay, all right, perfect.
So why clinical science? So thank you, sir. Thank you, Rakesh, sir, for giving this opportunity to share this platform. And beginning with the clinical science. So imagine an exam wherein you have a colleague who is very well read, who has got a lot of knowledge, lot of fund of knowledge. So you instantly have a disadvantage and you may think that you will fail. But one thing which can protect you, one thing which can save your day will be elicitation of clinical science. So clinical science are very important. They form the base, they form the foundation. Even after passing in your life, they are very important, beyond and above and over which you can build your thing. So if your foundation is not correct, if your signs are not proper, things are difficult. So now why Babinski sign? So Babinski is an age-old sign. It has survived 100 years. It was first described by Babinski in 1896. And there is a paper which says that 100 years on and it is still glorified, and it is a part and parcel, very important part of our clinical examination. It has got a lot of controversy. There was a lot of criticism. There have been papers saying that is Babinski necessary in clinical exam, or should we move to foot tapping or other signs which are better for pyramidal dysfunction? But against all this, Babinski still remains a very important sign, and it has proved that yes, it will still remain and will continue to do so in future. So it is the most important neurological reflex. So how have I made this topic? As already said, Babinski is of great clinical importance. It is important for us in our practical exams because a lot of questions come to us regarding that. It has got a historical importance. Many times, examiners like Dr. SVK will ask you, tell me one scientist you know of. At which time this talk will help you, as in you can get to know about Babinski, who he was. So every time examiner will give you one option, tell me about any one scientist. So if you are not aware of such things, then you are at loss. So even as a student, I did not like history and I did not prepare for it, but this is a corner which is kept untouched, and it is a very important thing which can help you in score and even impress the examiner. Also, as I could do my research on it, it has got research prospects. It's a basic science topic. So it is very different, and it is a basic research which you could do in such different science of neurology. So why am I doing? As I already said that during my DM tenure, I got this opportunity to work with the biggest scientist of the century, I will say, Dr. Khadilkar, under whose guidance I could publish this paper, which was my thesis topic. And we will see about it in a while. And as I had already done the literature search, I got this platform. So now comes the $1 million question. Why does the great toe go up? So at the onset, let me say you, it's not the great toe alone. It is the flexor synergy response. It is the entire limb, which is important when we are talking about Babinski. So coming to the physiology, in an infant, when you stimulate the plantar surface, you will find the great toe getting extended. There is dorsiflexion of the ankle, there is flexion at the knee, and there is flexion at the hip, causing limb shortening. It is equivalent to a withdrawal response. So this is called as flexor synergy response. It is a response to any noxious stimulus which causes the limb to move away from that stimulus. So that is what is withdrawal response. In an infant, it is called as flexor synergy response. As one grows beyond infancy, pyramidal tract matures. With the maturation, they have control over the peripheral motor neurons, which they synapse in the spinal cord. So this inhibitory control of the pyramidal tracts over the peripheral motor neurons causes the plantar stimulation response to become flexor beyond infancy. So whenever there is pyramidal tract dysfunction, you will again get re-emergence of what was there in infancy, and you will get an extensor response. So some people say Babinski is nothing but re-emergence of withdrawal response, which is physiological in infancy. And beyond infancy, it is considered pathological and suggestive of pyramidal dysfunction. The downward response is the local skin reflex. So everyone knows the reflex arc. The reflexogenic zone is S1 dermatome. From there, the afferent goes to the spinal cord from L4 to S2. And then the efferent comes via the tibial nerve, and you get the extension of the great toe. Whereas in the normal physiological response, it goes through the common peroneal and you will get the plantar flexion of the great toe. So when is an upgoing toe a Babinski sign? So again, these 3 points are very important and they form the crux of the topic. Extensor hallucis longus must be responsible for the upgoing great toe. So the toe dorsiflexors are extensor hallucis longus and tibialis anterior. Tibialis anterior actually acts at the foot, and foot dorsiflexion will give you an impression that even the great toe has moved into dorsiflexion. In that case, you need to see the EHL contraction. So EHL is the tendon which is just at the dorsum of the foot from the base of the great toe. Simultaneously, you should find contraction of other flexor muscles of the lower limb, which are tensor fascia lata, which you can palpate. If not visible, then you should be able to palpate the muscle over the thigh, which gets contracted along with the EHL to result in the Babinski sign. And third most important point is the response should be reproducible. So if you do it a couple of times, it should give you the same response. So these are the points which tell us that yes, it is a true Babinski response. There is a difference between cortical and subcortical pyramidal tract lesion in the Babinski sign. We all know the pyramidal tract starts from the cortex, then from there the cortex has the cell bodies of the pyramidal neurons. The axons go via the white matter from the corona radiata, internal capsule, then through the brainstem, and finally the end in the spinal cord. So whatever is below cortex is called subcortical. In the subcortical region, they are densely packed. So a subcortical affection of pyramidal tracts causes fanning of toes plus the extension of great toe. So this is what is the difference. Whereas in the cortical lesion, you may get only the extension of great toe, you may not get the fanning. That is what has been seen and described in the literature. Fanning of great toes along with extension will be seen in subcortical affection, whereas only great toe extension will be more with cortical, as the neurons are dispersed at the cortex, whereas at the subcortical level, they are compact. How to elicit Babinski sign? So again, this is the picture from the Babinski's collection. What he did was he suggested that a noxious stimulus, not noxious enough to elicit a withdrawal, but enough to cause pain or pricky sensation, which causes, he stimulated the lateral aspect of the foot, and he went in a curvilinear fashion, just keeping it short of the base of the great toe, as it can cause local reaction, which is flexure. So that is the correct way of eliciting the plantar response. Always before eliciting, you should inform the patient that you are going to have this stimulation, as it avoids withdrawal and a patient is prepared for a noxious stimuli. You can ask the patient to move to look at the opposite direction. Also important is to undress below the level of hip, because you want to see the contractions of other muscles along with the extensor of the toe, which will help you decide whether this is the true Babinski response. So you ask them to expose the area which you want to see. You are especially interested in tensor fascia lata contraction whenever there is extension at the great toe. And the reflex area is best, which is lateral aspect of the foot. As you move medially, you can elicit a grasp reflex, which will appear as a plantar reflex. Plantar flexion of the great toe can occur. So this can give a false impression that it is Babinski negative, even in patients with pyramidal dysfunction. About the sign, specificity of this sign is 100%, which means that whenever a trained neurologist or a person who is good at clinical science says that Babinski sign is positive, he means to say that there is definite pyramidal dysfunction or definite involvement of pyramidal tracts. But if the sign is negative, it does not mean that there is there will not be pyramidal affection. So even if pyramidal affection is there, you may get a negative sign. But if you are saying the sign is positive, it means that 100% affection of pyramidal system is there. So sensitivity again has ranged from 50% to 90% in different studies. And the reasons for same we will be discussing. There are other factors to Babinski like inter-observer variability. That is, two people observing a phenomena may give different responses, whereas the same person who can examine the patient at a different interval will also be having different opinions, or even with the same opinion, he may not be 100% sure whether this is extensor or this is flexor. So that has been a problem with Babinski, and so the sign was in controversy and has faced a lot of criticism in past. How has this been reduced? We will see in the following slides. So what is negative Babinski despite pyramidal dysfunction? Why Babinski does not come positive? It can be a joint deformity, like it is very difficult to plantar stimulate, and it is difficult to appreciate the movement of the great toe. There can be concurrent LMN lesion. Whenever there is a LMN plus UMN syndrome, LMN usually rides above the UMN. Like if the peripheral nerve, if the tibial nerve involvement is there, if there is neuropathy associated with pyramidal dysfunction, you may not get grade 2 extension. If there is incomplete pyramidal syndrome, what does this suggest? If the pyramidal affection is not there, which pyramidal supply to the distal muscles of the lower limb are spared, then you may not get a Babinski sign. So that is called as incomplete pyramidal syndrome. Also, if there is spinal shock, as you know, because of the segmental dysfunction, spinal segmental dysfunction, you may not get positive Babinski. What are myths associated with this sign? People usually feel only the first movement counts, which is wrong. A true Babinski sign will have fanning of smaller toes. Again, as we have seen, this may not be always seen. Sometimes fanning can be physiological, and sometimes even in true Babinski, you may not get fanning. And when in doubt, you cannot use Babinski variants. Again, Babinski variants, when they are used, it helps your confidence, and especially the interpretation improves when you use Babinski along with Babinski variants. Three basic variants are Oppenheim, Chaddock, and Gordon, which we will see in the coming slide. So why we interpret Babinski sign wrongly? Because of the contraction of tibialis anterior, the foot goes up, that is dorsiflexion of foot occurs, and you may think that it is the grade 2 which is going up. So toe goes up passively and it is not EHL. So EHL contraction is very important. Very active flexion synergy. Sometimes even beyond infancy, the flexion synergy remains very active. In this case, there will be a great flexor response, after which you will see the great toe again coming back to its neutral position, which may be taken as a positive Babinski or extensor response. So again, this creates a false impression of Babinski. Some people have this voluntary toe wriggling. This is called as pseudo Babinski. They are usually sensitive individuals, and the response is jerky, inconsistent, and it is not synchronous with the flexor response of the other muscles. So in Babinski, all the muscles contract simultaneously. So that is very important. You should palpate the thigh to look at the tensor fascial lata contraction. Along with the same time, you will have to observe the grade 2 extension. And already said that relative movement, when there is the other toes which go down, you may think that the grade 2 is up, which gives an illusion of an extensor response. Also, there can be isolated fanning of toes, which can be physiological, and sometimes it may be missing in Babinski sign. So Babinski equivalent in this diagram, the green arrow, that is the medial shaft of the tibia. When it is stimulated with a firm pressure, it can give the Babinski extensor response. It can give an extensor response at the grade toe, which is called as Oppenheim sign. If you firmly compress the lower calf muscles, again, you can elicit an extensor response. And if the skin beneath the lateral malleoli is stimulated, you will get an extensor response. So all this just indicates the increased reflexogenic area in patients with pyramidal dysfunction. People have even seen that sometimes just spontaneous responses can occur if even with the flash of wind, or sometimes you will get an extensor response. So the reflexogenic area becomes intense or it increases whenever there is pyramidal dysfunction, and which is responsible for the various number of signs which have been described in the at the same time where Babinski described, or immediately after Babinski could describe his sign. So these are the various terms which are often heard when we are talking about Babinski, that is minimal Babinski sign, in which you will see only the contraction of tensor fascia lata and thigh muscles getting activated, whereas the great toe will not show extensor. So even only tensor fascia lata contraction with plantar stimulation can be considered as positive Babinski. True Babinski is one which has the complete response, which involves the extension of great toe flexor, that is dorsiflexion at ankle, flexion at knee, and flexion at hip. It does not have fanning of great toe as a component. Pseudo Babinski, as we have seen, is due to sensitivity, and it involves wriggling of great toes, and it is not synchronous with the contraction of other muscles. Inversion of plantar flexion. This is because of damage to the plantar flexors, which causes a false positive Babinski, or whenever you stimulate the plantar surface and the plantar flexors are paralyzed, you will get the impression that the great toe may go up. So that is inversion of plantar reflex. Tonic Babinski reflex is seen in patients with frontal lobe affection and extrapyramidal patients. Crossed extensor response is whenever there is bilateral affection, that is in spinal cord or bicerebral affection. You may get, when you stimulate one side, you may get response on the other side. Spontaneous Babinski, as we have said, even without your stimulation, sometimes the great toe can get extended, which can be due to even the wind stimulus, or sometimes without any stimulus, the toe may remain in extended position. Now coming to the research part of it. So as we have seen that there was inter and intra-observer variability in Babinski elicitation and in Babinski interpretation. So we had to, Sir had this idea that can we make an instrument which can deliver a measured force and velocity of stimulus, so that we can have standardization of our stimulation, and then we can study the responses. We tried to video record all the movements which were taking place at the great toe, and so then we can later point, we can analyze each and every response. And there was this great thing about differentiating physiological and pathological extensor response, which we could do once we can get to know the characteristics of each. So how did we do it? We developed this instrument with the help of my colleagues or friends, in which we had this syringe which was at one end connected to a pressure gauge, which could record what force I was applying, what pressure I was applying, and at the other end there was a stimuli. So this was a battery operated instrument which could help me give a fixed pressure. So we divided the sole in different parts, and we tried to study point stimulation and stroke stimulation as to know which one was better and what is the best place to elicit the plantar response. Again, replicating the history, I got that lateral stimulations are better. The one which was described by Babinski, in which he uses the curvilinear stroke stimulation. Initially, even he started with point stimulation, and then he said that something which comes in a stroke is more better than point. And he also mentioned that lateral border of foot or lateral aspect of foot is the best area to elicit Babinski. So that was what our findings were, but we could do it more objectively, as we could give a fixed amount of pressure and study the responses. So these were our results, in which we tried to differentiate extensor from withdrawal response, and we could see that reproducibility is a very important thing. And if asymmetric, it is very easy to know, because if the patient is withdrawing to your stimulus, he will withdraw it from both his feet. If it is asymmetric, it is usually extensor response due to pyramidal dysfunction. So temporal and spatial summation of stimulus is again very important. When your stimulation goes for a particular time and beyond a particular area, you get an extensor response. So that is responsible for Babinski sign. So you will always have this temporal and spatial summation with true Babinski, whereas withdrawal will be abrupt response. As soon as you touch, sometimes the patient goes into a withdrawal response.